The plates rattled in the dining saloon when the ship lurched hard to starboard, the kind of sickening twist that snapped conversation into silence. Then came the sound no sailor mistook, a grinding, tearing shriek from the hull that ran through the floorboards and into the bones of everyone aboard. Lights fluttered. Someone shouted that they had struck. In the next breath, the Mohegan pitched again, threw men against bulkheads and women against chairbacks, and the steamer's steady vibration stopped as if a giant hand had gripped the screws. Water thundered somewhere below. A steward's tray slid the length of the carpet and crashed. The ship began to list, slowly at first, then with a roll that made every step a fight. Just a day earlier, on October 13, 1898, the Atlantic Transport Line steamer SS Mohegan had cleared Tilbury bound for New York. She was new under that name, rebuilt and renamed after an unhappy first voyage as Cleopatra, and she carried 57 passengers, 97 crew, and a few cattlemen with general cargo in her holds. Captain Richard Griffith, 42, drove her hard down the channel at roughly 13 knots, lights burning and dinner hot in the saloon as Cornwall drew abeam. By late afternoon, the coast of Cornwall rode the starboard beam when it should have been a smudge on the horizon. Men who knew their lighthouses noticed the Eddystone too far off, the land too close, but the ship held her speed. Off Coverack, a Coast Guard fired warning rockets into the early evening. From shore, they watched Mohegan maintain course toward the black teeth of the Manacles, a reef that guarded the approaches to the Helford River and Falmouth Bay. On board, dinner continued, the clatter of plates and cutlery overlaying the hum of machinery. At 6:50 p.m., the helmsman felt the rudder wrench. The ship had struck Vassrock. Steel screamed. The rudder tore away and the hull ripped open. Water rushed into the engine room within minutes. Gauges shattered. The dynamos failed and the lights died, leaving passageways striped with lamplight and sudden dark. Without steering, the current swung her onto the Manacles reef. The second impact rolled her so steeply that people on the weather side clawed for handholds, while those to leeward slid across the deck into rails and coamings. On deck, the officers ordered the boats out. Earlier, to prevent a rush in emergency, Captain Griffith had ordered a second inboard guardrail along the lifeboats. In a drill, it seemed wise. In the tilt of a sinking ship, it trapped hands and jammed tackles. Mohegan listed first to port and then heavily to starboard, tearing davits and making a clean launch nearly impossible. Only 2 boats got away, one swamped, the other later capsized. Below, stewards tried to move passengers up in the dark, counting as best they could while the deck angles grew cruel. From Port Housetalk, Coxswain James Hill had already mustered the RNLI crew of the lifeboat Charlotte. They pulled into the surf by oar and sail, guided by shoremen who had rowed out to mark where the ship had vanished. At the wreck site, only the masts and funnel stood above water with figures clinging to them. The sea was too rough for a direct approach. Quartermaster John Juddery swam a line from the rigging to the lifeboat and back again, and the crew used it to work close enough to haul people aboard. In roughly a quarter of an hour from the first strike, the Mohegan was gone. The numbers printed in papers varied, but one figure did not. 106 lives were lost, among them Captain Griffith and most of his officers. Dozens survived because lifeboat crews refused to quit the groundswell, because a quartermaster tied a rope to his own body, because people in small boats rowed into the wash of a dying steamer. Bodies washed ashore through the night and into the next day. Villagers warmed survivors by stoves and lanterns and set off again with blankets and stretchers. In the days that followed, the parish bore the work of recovery. Mass graves were opened in the churchyard at St. Keverne. Mourners stood among open coffins. Labels were tied to sleeves. Names were written down when they were known. The Atlantic Transport Line donated a stained glass window in memory of those who had perished. Other families claimed bodies for return home. A few were sent across the Atlantic on a sister ship bound for New York. Divers went over the side to salvage cargo. One lost his life in the attempt. Questions gathered faster than answers. How had a steel liner, running in clear weather with familiar lights on the coast, driven straight into a marked reef? Witnesses said the course looked wrong for miles. Coast guards swore to the warning rockets they fired. Officers earlier that day had remarked on the Eddystone lying too far off to starboard and the land too close. Theories followed. An error in bearing, a misread compass, judgment under pressure to keep speed. The Board of Trade heard evidence and found no single defect that fully explained the navigation. What remained was a straight line on the chart that should never have been drawn so near the Manacles at that speed. Divers found the wreck shouldered between granite spines, broken open with boilers exposed. Over time, storms pushed the hull down into gullies until only larger shapes held their lines. Fishermen learned where not to set gear. In calm weather, the water over the Manacles looked harmless, flat pewter under a gray sky, but the reef sat feet below the surface in places, waiting. Locals could point to where Mohegan hit Vase Rock and to the patch of white water that marked Main Vose. For families across the Atlantic and along the Channel coast, the telegrams were brief. Some messages reported a survivor found in a lifeboat. Most carried a name and the word drowned. Company offices stayed open to answer questions from relatives who arrived with photographs and descriptions of clothing. Lists were posted, corrected, and posted again. Newspapers printed the same questions heard at the quays. Why so close to shore? Why so fast? Why no turn when the rockets rose? The tragedy fixed the Manacles in public memory as a place where navigation allowed no error. Captains running past the Lizard already knew that. Now passengers knew it too. Long after, divers swam through pipes and ribs that had once been a living ship. Underwater, the outline of the disaster remained. A ripped side, a fallen funnel, debris spread across the bottom like a path. The reef did not change. The lesson did. In the end, the timeline stayed plain. A late afternoon passage with the coast too close. Warning rockets bright against the dusk. A strike at Vase Rock at 6:50, a second tearing impact on Main Vose. A lifeboat launch slowed by an extra rail meant to prevent panic. Lights out, engines drowned, and within about 12 minutes, a liner gone. Survivors owed their lives to the pull of an oar and the strength of a rope, and to a coxswain who held a lifeboat steady in dark seas on a reef that had already claimed so many. Back in St. Keverne, the mass graves settled and grass grew over them. The stained glass window threw colored light across the pews on bright mornings, the names of the lost held in its panes. Out beyond the beach, the Manacles kept their shape in every season. On quiet days, the surface seemed calm enough to forget what lay underneath. But anyone who had stood on those cliffs on that October night never looked at that water as empty water again. The memorial drew visitors for years, sailors home on leave, families tracing names, and local children brought in on rainy Sundays to see the colored glass and hear the story. In nearby cottages, survivors told the same sequence again and again: the scrape, the list, the roar of water in the dark, and the pull of strong hands into a boat that smelled of wet rope and tar. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.